Chapter 5: The Road to Guaymas. We drove in silence. I searched my mind for something to say, but small talk had never been my strong point. Each topic that arose as a possibility for discussion, I immediately discarded as either too trivial or too technical for casual conversation. The stringent gatekeeper, lodged somewhere in the back of my mind, kept censoring every topic before I could bring it up. "Who was that beautiful woman in the bakery?" I asked out of the blue. "What woman?" he replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "I don't recall anyone in particular." I didn't know how to broach the subject without sounding jealous and possessive, so I let it drop. Yet, I couldn't get that person out of my mind. I was sure she was not Mexican, for although her skin was dark, it was more a tanned than a natural pigment. I had not been close enough to see her eyes, but if I had, I know they would have been blue. From her dress, I had the certainty that she was from the United States, and from her manner, I suspected that she and Carlos were more than casual acquaintances. I laughed at myself as I realized that I was already in competition with a woman I had not even met. In spite of the recapitulation I had done under Clara's and Emilito's guidance, I was still reacting like a woman rather than in the disciplined and detached manner of a sorcerer. Clara had warned me that my behavior with respect to men would be a most difficult pattern to break. For certain attitudes and expectations were inculcated in girls at an early age in order to fulfill their social and biological imperatives. Femaleness, Clara had warned me soon after I had begun my recapitulation, includes being jealous, possessive, and treating one's man as if he were a helpless dependent child. It involves the mandate that if he strays or digresses, he will have to be forgiven, for that is the lot a woman is expected to bear. She must stand by her man under all conditions. "I would never put up with such behavior," I said adamantly. "You'll be horrified at what you uncover upon examining your life," she said, laughing. "You'll put up with whatever your mother put up with, and you yourself told me that she had to put up with a great deal." Remembering Clara's words made me realize that in spite of my professed change, I was still looking into a mirror in which my idea of how a woman ought to behave governed my feelings and actions. "How much further to Guaymas?" I asked, emerging from my self-reflection. "About an hour," Carlos said. Heath, too, had been lost in thought, although I was certain it was not about himself, and having answered my question he returned to that inner silence from which I had aroused him. I resented his mental retreat, yet I had no qualms in doing the same thing myself. I realized there existed a lack of fairness in my treatment of others. I expected others to carry the burden of the interaction, to entertain or instruct me, while I remained the passive recipient. It was a mode of behavior I had learned as a child from my mother. She had ingrained in me that a girl should speak only when spoken to, meaning that in polite company, I had to sit quietly and not make myself a nuisance by asking silly questions. I had always wondered why that rule didn't apply to my brothers, who instead of sitting quietly, were rowdy and climbed over the furniture of the friends we were visiting, as if they had the run of the house. On top of that, everyone had found them to be lively and rambunctious boys. Once learned, I had kept the rule of quiet passivity, not bothering to revise it as an adult. In recompense, I always kept up a lively inner dialogue, to the point of laughing or snickering at my own silent jokes. During my stay with Clara, she had immediately put a stop to this autocentric behavior. I received a sound rap on the head from her whenever she saw my lips moving, or detected even so much as a smile on my face that wasn't warranted by external events, but having been away from the sorcerer's influence for many months, the habit of talking to myself had returned. "Why is it so difficult to change?" I had once asked Clara after a day of recapitulating in the cave near her house. We sat down in the kitchen where she handed me a plate of stew. As we ate, she explained that the power to change depended on one's energy. She then put forth the sorcery thesis that the sexual excitation of one's parents at the moment of conception determined the energetic configuration of the infant. "What exactly does that mean, Clara?" I asked. "If there was little or no excitation during the sex act, the child born out of that union will be as dull as a plugged nickel, she explained. On the other hand, if both parents were excited, then the child will have the energy and optimism to meet life head-on and delight in whatever comes his way. What happens if only one of the parents was excited? I asked. You tell me, she replied, peering at me. You ought to know from personal experience. The person gets enthusiastic for a while and then she peters out, I admitted. One is imbalanced and unstable. Clara nodded. They know that ultimately they don't have the energy to go through with whatever they start. So they give up halfway. They never bring anything to fruition, they are defeated before they even begin. What can one do about it? I asked. They can tighten their belts and intend themselves different, she said. How do they intend themselves different? A person with little energy has to project herself out of herself. She has to link up with a different dream. She has to dream herself anew. To dream oneself anew sounds like a metaphor, I said, sighing. Is it really possible to change? It certainly is, Clara said. But first you have to recapitulate your undisciplined life and puke it out. Then you begin dreaming a new being, one with vigor and lots of energy to spare. Little by little, you wake up the energy body until your acts and feelings match your new being. Every strong and precise act will reinforce the dreaming body, and your dream being will give power to your daily acts. In this way, you hoist yourself out of yourself on the wings of intent. Remembering Clara's words filled me with courage and optimism. I pressed a place along my left side just above the spleen, a point Clara had said was useful for becoming alert and for getting a bit of added energy whenever one felt despondent, listless, or drowsy. I glanced at Carlos. What is the population of Guaymas? I asked, again attempting conversation. I passed through there several years ago. I suppose it's really grown. Carlos gave me a curious look as if he wasn't sure I was really interested in talking about the population of Guaymas. It has grown in the past few years, but I don't know what the population is. If it hadn't been getting dark, he might have noticed my lips moving as I began to repeat some power words to myself. As it was, my dismal mood was lost in the descending twilight. The darkness was settling like a gray filter, covering the eyes. To the west, the sky became a deep purple with red streaks where the sun had already set. The low hills in the distance were black cutouts pasted against the gray-black sky. From time to time, we passed a few saguaro cacti, silhouetted against the low hills. Their thick arms were turned upward, outstretched to the black heavens as if they had been frozen in a posture of supplication. All the saguaro were the same. Some were taller than others, some had stubbier armatures, but they were all hoping for the same thing, grace to drop from heaven, in the form of gentle rain, droplets of mist to quench their eternal thirst. I had forgotten how noisy the night in the city was compared to the utter stillness of the desert. I rested my head against the seat's headrest and listened to the thumping of the car tires passing over the rough road. From the sounds, I could detect that the left rear tire was low, for the wheels were not evenly balanced and an extra thump arose from that direction. It caught my attention and the rhythmic thud lulled me into a half-sleep. I smiled at the thought that if Carlos had wanted to hold a conversation now, I wouldn't be able to come up with a coherent comment. For a hypnotic spell had taken hold of me, and I was feeling heavy, drowsy, so that I could barely keep my eyes open. The road ahead was straight, illuminated by the bright car headlights. It formed a long, gray tunnel that pulled my gaze into it, guided by the white center dividing line that peaked in the distance. It took too much effort to pull my eyes away from the road, so I just kept staring at the white line sucking me into a long, deep tunnel, making me drowsier and drowsier. With great effort I shifted my eyes to the side of the road. To my amazement, the landscape had changed. The desert was gone. Gone were the saguaro cacti, the dusty shrubs, and the occasional tumbleweed that I had seen rolling along the roadside. Instead, we were driving through a forest and I was seeing giant pine trees on either side of the road. The trees were as tall as the sky, which had disappeared in a mass of dark, piney branches. Since I wasn't asleep, I knew it was a mirage, but not one that was frightening, it rather was astounding. I let my senses explore the trees, which were becoming more and more delineated as we moved through them. Some of the trees were giant redwood with furry bark, long straight trunks and bushy tops. They were so close together that there was no way to see beyond them, to see what was holding them up. Mirage or not, in the darkness, they seemed to be as real as the grove of trees I had seen while driving in Northern California. All of a sudden the road was curving as if we were in the mountains. Not being familiar with the landscape around Guaymas, I thought perhaps we were climbing into hilly terrain. I allowed myself to go with the scenery and didn't bother to evaluate it with my rational knowledge of the Sonoran Desert and of redwood forests. Watching the trees pass became for me a form of entertainment. I found myself looking out for bear, or hoping to spot a deer, but I didn't. I was so intrigued with the vision that I could not tell how much time had passed. Carlos was driving slower than usual, as if he too were afraid a deer might dart across the road. I made no mention of the forest of trees that surrounded us, for I was certain Carlos would think me crazy, and the scenery would disappear. Besides, I no longer had the ability to speak. I could barely think, let alone voice my thoughts. Then I stopped thinking altogether and sunk into a heavy silence, watching the trees, waiting for a phantom animal to move among them, and finally, just watching. John Michael Abelar had once told me that men were not the only creatures who could attain a state of heightened awareness. Dogs, deer, crows, any animal can have a direct line to intent, he had said. We call them magical creatures. Sorcerers seek them and use them as aids or helpers. I must have fallen asleep because at one point I was no longer sitting in the front seat of Carlos's car, but on some sort of hard wooden bench. My head was tilted back, resting on a thick post, and instead of looking up at the inside of the car, I was looking up at some giant trees in front of Clara's house. I was practicing a gazing exercise that Emilito had taught me, and I was sitting on that special bench he had constructed according to ancient sorcerers' specifications. This particular gazing bench was designed specifically for gazing at trees. The 3 posts that supported the back of the bench were about 6 inches square and 6 inches taller than the top horizontal plank that served as the back of the bench. The tops of the posts were cut at a slant so that when sitting on the bench, one could lean the head back against one of the 3 thick protruding vertical posts. They were cut at a perfect angle so that when the head was tilted back, it allowed one to gaze upward without having to strain the neck or hold up the head. One could then be totally relaxed during the gazing practice, whether one was gazing at trees, at clouds, or at the moon or stars at night. This particular bench was set in front of a grove of trees, 3 of which stood out from the rest. The bench allowed 3 persons to gaze simultaneously, and, if they wished, go into states of dreaming together. Emilito was sitting beside me on the bench with his head resting on the post at the other end. He was also gazing upward at one of the 3 trees that were on a slight hill some distance away. Emilito was gazing at the left one, the one that corresponded to his position on the bench, while I was gazing at the one on the right, directly in line with my point of vision. The trees were outlined against the purple-blue sky. I was totally relaxed looking at the tree in front of me. It was voluminous, green with swirls of lighter green foliage that seemed to be alive and moved even when there was no wind. In between the thick swirling foliage, there were dark empty spaces where I could see the articulation of the branches. Look carefully at every feature of your tree, Emilito said softly. Without moving your head off the gazing post, listen to my instructions, then do what I say. I relaxed and waited for his whispered directives. He told me to begin at the trunk of the tree and sweep my eyes upward, first incorporating the lower branches, and then moving upward by sweeping the tufts of leaves with my gaze. I did as he said, relaxing completely, letting the energy from my eyes sweep the tree trunk and gradually ascend. Leave your head where it is, just move your gaze in the direction of the tree's growth, he said. If your gaze gets lost, stuck, or distracted, begin again at the bottom. I repeated the sweeping procedure perhaps 20 times, always beginning at the bottom, then sweeping my eyes upward along every part of the tree, its trunk, the side where the tree met the sky, moving toward the thick bushy parts in the center, and gently along the visible brown branches and out to the foliage again. I continued this movement until I had covered the entire surface of the tree, then I began again. After giving me my initial instructions, Emilito was silent and I sensed he was gazing at the tree on the far left that corresponded with his position on the bench. I was curious about the other trees, so I turned my head slightly, shifting my gaze. Instantly, I felt a poke in my left side. He had poked me with a stick that was lying on the bench between us, that I hadn't noticed it before. "Stay in your own tree," Emilito snapped. Curiosity killed the squirrel. I wanted to tell him it was the cat, but I didn't dare correct him. "These trees are not the same," Emilito explained. "Each one must be gazed at from its proper place on the bench." "How are they different?" I asked, not daring to move my eyes off the tree in front of me. "They are different in the same way people are different," he replied. "They have their own mood and temperament, their own energy. You know enough about trees from climbing and living in them to realize they are not the same." That was true. Trees were as different in temperament as people. Each tree I climbed was a unique being with a history often longer than the lifespan of man. From climbing them, I had learned to sense the trees' subtle moods, their changes, their needs, and even their outpouring of affection. Trees were solitary beings, yet underneath the ground horrendous things were taking place. The roots were intertwined in a mass of growth, competing for every inch of space and moisture. I learned that human beings were nothing in their aggressiveness and competitiveness when compared to trees. Their roots twisted and pushed and strangled each other in an endeavor to survive, going through the most intricate contortions to stake their claim to life. From above the ground, trees seemed more stable. I realized that it was precisely because trees were so aware and stable that a great part of my sorcerer's training had taken place strapped in a harness, suspended from a tree or while living in a treehouse. "That's right, Taisha," Emilito said, picking up my thoughts. "That's why you became a tree dweller. The instability of your double demanded it. You were learning how to stalk with the double. You had to stay in the trees until your assemblage point stabilized in its new position." I remembered I was not allowed to come down from the trees except to go to the bathroom. The rest of the time I stayed up there recapitulating or climbing from branch to branch with my tree climbing gear. Whenever I wanted something to eat, I would have to shout for Emilito to bring me my food. At first, I was reluctant to shout, for I had been taught that ladies never raised their voices, but I knew from past experience that shouting was the only way Emilito would respond. I would squat and let out a shriek so loud that all the birds around me would fly off in fright, but gradually, the birds got used to my shouting and would just peer at me with one black eye as if I were a strange bird making even stranger noises. Then Emilito would appear at the foot of the tree with a basket of food that he would hoist up to the platform where I was sitting. "I too was once a tree dweller," Emilito said, again reading my thoughts. "We were both a bit batty, touched in the head." Just to prove his point, he gave me another unexpected poke in the ribs. "And this little branch," he added, giggling, "is to make sure inexperienced gazers don't fly off into the tree or fall asleep on the bench. If I sense you flying or falling asleep, I'll poke you like this." He chuckled and gave me another poke. "I'm not falling asleep," I said, annoyed. Although, at one point in my gazing, I had the feeling I had been sucked into the tree as if I were sitting on one of its branches. Emilito let out a howl. "Are you sure you're not asleep?" he said. "Maybe you already fell asleep while I wasn't watching." "I did not," I said, and to prove it I pinched myself on the spot below the left floating rib, the place where he had been poking me. Then I brought my eyes back to the tree corresponding to my end of the bench and repeated the gazing sweeping motion in a most detailed and deliberate manner. I repeated it again and again, feeling with my eyes, as Emilito had recommended, the patches, the differences in shading and texture, and the openings where the branches poked through. Now, move your gaze around the periphery of the tree where it meets the sky, Emilito instructed. Follow the outline of tree and sky with your gaze as if you were painting the tree with a long-handled brush. I did what he suggested, and all of a sudden the color of the tree changed from a dark green to a bright chartreuse, as if a gigantic spotlight had been turned on. The sky, instead of being a purple-black, turned into a bright blue-green. It happened so suddenly that I closed my eyes and pressed backwards against the bench. Luckily, the sturdy head post kept me from falling to the ground. When I opened my eyes again, the change of color was still in effect. Let the energy from the tree flood your eyes, Emilito said. Merge with the tree the way I showed you. When I did, the tree changed colors again. Now the sky was a bright gold, and the tree became a mass of dazzling peach-colored light. Each leaf was a bit of light superimposed on a simmering limb, forming a matrix of light. Layers and layers of light burst forth from the tree until I was looking at a pulsating, shimmering spread of energy that merged with the energy of the golden sky around it. It was a sight to behold. I realized then why different parts of the tree were different colors. They had different intensities of energy emanating from them. These patches corresponded with moods or feelings that the tree gave off, and there were dark spots, too. Places from which no light emanated. I knew that these were the shadow entities that inhabited a realm very close to our own, and sometimes crossed over. I was surprised to see some of these shadow beings climbing the tree branches the way I used to climb them. The light of the tree shimmered and moved as if wet, like raindrops illuminated by a car headlight. Nothing about the tree was static, it was absolutely fluid, impermanent. In one moment, my taken-for-granted impression of trees, that they were stable, sedentary and permanently rooted, was blasted away. Upon seeing the shimmering pulsating mass of yellow and white surrounded by the palest pink halo, I knew trees were in constant flux. Are you seeing it? Emilito asked. Yes, I gasped. Whoa. I had no idea trees looked like that. Don't get too excited or you'll shift your gaze back to normal vision, he warned. Stay relaxed and calm. Don't wake up. There you go again, Emilito. Forget your prodding stick. I'm really not asleep, but it certainly seems as if I were dreaming. Am I dreaming, Emilito? I asked, not daring to move my eyes away. Yes and no, he said. Gaze now, ask questions later. I remained still and silent, for I did not want the scene to dissipate. I feasted my eyes on the light for as long as I could. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished and I was again gazing at the enormous tree in front of me. It was as if a radiant apparition had vanished, leaving behind only its familiar outward form and the memory of something stupendous now gone. It was a shimmering ghost fading away, and the tree that had been so magnificent at the outset of my gazing was now a disappointment compared to seeing its true essence. You can open your eyes now, Emilito said, poking me in the ribs with his stick. The show's over. What a show! I said. I had no idea. Emilito raised a hand to silence me. Of course you had an idea, he said. We all know how to see the essence of things. We did it as infants, and you did some gazing while living in the trees. Have you forgotten how to shift your eyes and project your feeling? Are you looking and feeling only yourself and ignoring everything else? Stop, Emilito. Stop, I said, remorseful for all the time I had wasted looking at myself, when I could have been seeing trees and other things. Shallow as form, look behind, Emilito said, feigning an oriental accent. I had to laugh. I wondered where he had learned that Buddhist adage. He must have gotten it from Clara, who always had been spouting oriental aphorisms. You sound like a Buddhist monk, I said. Don't tell me you were in China, too, along with Clara? Emilito smiled and nodded. I'm the caretaker of this house, he said. But I do get around. Someday I'll tell you my story. Or, better yet, allow you to see for yourself. Emilito looked at me as if he had a stupendous secret to reveal. It gave me the shivers. He told me to examine the bench to see how it was put together so I could construct one myself in case I ever needed to. It was fastened with pegs pushed through drilled holes. I was impressed by its sturdy yet elegant construction. "This bench is a real help for gazing," I said. "A great design too." "Made by yours truly," he said with a bow. "Did you learn this in China?" I asked. No. The idea was handed down to the Nawal's lineage from the ancient sorcerers. The sorcerers of our line have all sorts of devices and gadgets to aid them in their dreaming and seeing and stalking. The leather harness in which you were suspended is one such aid, this gazing bench is another. Of course, they are only devices that make seeing and dreaming easier, but seeing and dreaming and stalking can be done without depending on any device. All one needs is an impeccable spirit, and of course, energy stored through the recapitulation, refraining from indulging, and inner silence, so that the energetic body or double can awake. Then one can stalk with it and do all kinds of things. "What do you mean by stalking with the double?" I asked. "What a silly question," he said, blinking at me. "That's what you were doing all those months in the trees. You were solidifying your energy body and stalking the trees and yourself with it, as well as the companions that lived up there with you." "What do you mean, companions?" I inquired. "Other than the squirrels and birds, I was up there by myself, and you know it." Emilito smacked his lips. "Like hell you were. What about your shadow companions?" I remembered seeing the shadow beings in the trees as I was gazing at the tree, and did recall seeing plenty of shadows while I was living in the treehouse. In fact, many of the smaller ones I had thought were birds hopping among the branches turned out to be small fluttering shadows. I told Emilito this fact. "As your energy body becomes clearer, you'll remember your friends more clearly. Now we are using the double to gaze at trees. You could even move from this bench into the trees themselves," Emilito continued. "You remembered doing the tree merging while standing under a tree. Someday when you have stored enough energy, you can try gazing from this bench again and we'll see if you can be catapulted into the tree. Maybe even some of the shadow beings will help you." "I'd rather just climb the tree with my tree climbing gear," I said. Somehow the idea of being sucked up into the treetops, or anywhere else for that matter, by a shadowy confederate, was too unsettling. The memory of crossing the threshold into the left side of the hall of Clara's house, where the other members of the Nawal's party had been waiting, was still too vivid. Some force had catapulted me with such a devastating push, that I flew right out of the house and beyond the recognizable world itself. Then I woke up hanging from a tree, with no recollection of what had happened, how I had gotten there, or how long I had been suspended. "Well, then, if you're scared of jumping into the treetops with your double, or of letting the shadow beings give you a push, how about making the trees move away from their spot?" "What are you saying, Emilito? That trees can move from their spot?" "That's right. Trees aren't what they seem at all. You saw that yourself. Once we see them as masses of light, we realize that they can merge with other energetic beings, just as we can move and merge with trees." "Are you saying that trees can actually change their position?" "Some trees can, but not all," Emilito clarified. "Just as some people or animals can get to their double, but not everyone has the energy to become aware of their other side and begin to stalk with it." "You mean a tree can pop up somewhere else?" "That's hard to believe, Emilito, mighty hard." "Not when you see trees as energy that's constantly changing," he insisted. "Energy never stays the same. It moves depending on its surroundings." His eyes became fierce as a bird of prey. "And," he added, "depending on who's commanding it." I had to waver in my certainty. The memory of seeing that tree glowing with a flowing light had given me the impression that it was in a state of flux. Perhaps Emilito was right after all, trees could move away from their spot. The ancient sorcerers, using their powers of seeing, would make an all-out search for such trees, which they called power trees, Emilito explained. They would form intense bonds with them. The tree then would become the sorcerer's ally and even transport them to different places. The sorcerers would aid the tree with their energy, and the tree would help the sorcerer in a symbiotic relationship. Sometimes a sorcerer would even merge with a tree permanently in order to temporarily prolong his own life. It sounds downright gruesome, I said. Like some sort of magic carpet sorcerers could sit on to travel. They didn't travel with them, they just moved with them. There is a difference, Emilito clarified. If they wanted to travel, they would change into a bird or a swift-footed animal such as the mountain lion, which are much more adept at traveling than our trees. What would they do with trees then? They would hide in them and move the trees to confuse whoever was pursuing them. In ancient times, sorcerers had fierce enemies who hounded them relentlessly. Sorcerers would hide or merge with the trees so that their enemy would become confused. Or they could cause an entire grove of trees to move together. Imagine seeing an army of trees advancing on you. Their enemies would die of sheer fright. Or trees can exchange positions to see what it's like to be on another spot. Emilito continued, but that takes tons of energy, even for a tree. And even if that happened, a person would not notice the switch unless he was a sorcerer. When Emilito said that trees could exchange places, I remembered an incident that happened in Clara's house. To the rear of the patio were several fruit trees, including a large zapote and a loquat. At one time, I had thought the loquat tree was on the right side of the patio, and the zapote on the left, but one day, after I had been staying with Clara for several months, I could have sworn that the trees had changed places. I discovered that it was the zapote tree that was on the right side of the patio shading the bench Clara and I often sat on. When I mentioned this to Clara, she immediately hushed me up and told me not to speak of the zapote ever again. That wasn't difficult to do because I discarded my speculation as an absurd impossibility. Now, in the light of what Emilito was saying about trees, I wasn't so certain anymore. Perhaps those trees had exchanged positions. I asked Emilito about this. He said that the trees in the Nawal's house were very special, they had power and, therefore, they could do whatever they liked. They could bloom out of season, bear fruit all year around, or exchange places if they wished. That's hard to believe, I said. And yet. Enough talk. You've used up your dreaming attention. It's time to wake up. Rest your head against the gazing bench. What do you mean it's time to wake up? I'm already awake. You asked me before whether you were awake or dreaming. Now I can tell you that you are awake and asleep at the same time. You are awake in your double, but asleep in your physical body. He leaned toward me and gently pushed my head backwards against the bench post. I felt a prickling pressure on my forehead and then at the back of my neck and head. I saw Emilito's face so close yet so clearly that I began to suspect that he was right, I was dreaming. The thought of having to leave and go back to the everyday world created in me such a sadness that tears came to my eyes. I didn't want to leave Emilito and the grove of trees. I resisted waking up. I wanted to ask him more about the loquat and the zapote, and about gazing, and about how trees are able to move from their spots, and most of all, about his own secret story that he promised to reveal to me. Emilito, I called as if I were up in the treehouse waiting for my meal. Emilito. But the scene in front of me had already shifted and I was no longer outside Clara's house sitting on the gazing bench. Emilito's energy had added stability to the dreaming reality, but now that he was gone, I was unable to control the scene. I could no longer see him, yet an intense longing stayed with me. Then I again felt the pressure on the back of my neck as if Emilito's hand was pushing me against the post, and my head was bursting with a prickly energy that forced my eyes to slowly open. I first saw the car ceiling, then the dashboard. Then Carlos sitting behind the driver's wheel. The headrest pushing against my neck had made it numb. The prickly sensation traveled down my shoulders and into my back, arms and hands. I was awake, but I couldn't move. I felt like my head was made of electrified styrofoam, light and sizzling at the same time. I remained silent with my eyes open for a while longer, not moving. How long have I been sleeping? I asked, trying to straighten up. About an hour, Carlos replied. How much further to Guaymas? I asked, then laughed because it was exactly the same question I had asked just before I had fallen asleep. Yet it seemed ages ago. It's just round the bend, Carlos said, as a huge hill came into view. We'll get something to eat and spend the night there. Tomorrow we'll head east to the Yaqui towns and see what our power brings us. I could detect the faint glow of the city in the distance. A shiver went through me as a dark shadow fluttered by the car for a moment, obscuring its headlights.